In the relation to Gothic monstrosity, it is all too easy to understand how the relation between fear and desire may be Oedipalized, psychologized, humanized. Psychoanalysis itself has a clinical term for the transformation of desire into fear and of the desired, feared object into monster, paranoia. Freud believed that his theory of paranoia as a repressed homosexual desire could be applied to any and all cases of paranoia, regardless of race or social class. This, of course, is where the psychoanalytic crisis begins and ends, in its attempt to reduce everything to the sexual, and then in its equation of sexuality and identity. The process by which political material becomes sexual material is one in which the novel plays a major role. And the Gothic novel, particularly the late Victorian Gothic novel, provides a metaphor for this process in the form of the monster. The monster is the product of and the symbol for the transformation of identity into sexual identity through the mechanism of failed repression. One Lacanian account of monstrosity demonstrates simultaneously the appeal and the danger of psychoanalytic explanations. In Slavoj Žižek's essay, Grimaces of the Real, or When the Phallus Appears, he reads the phantom from the Phantom of the Opera alongside such enigmatic images as the vampire, Edvard Munch's The Scream, and David Lynch's Elephant Man, 1980. Žižek attempts to position images of the living dead as both mediators between high art and mass culture, and as the void of the pure self. Žižek is at his most persuasive when he discusses the multiplicity of meaning generated by the monster. The fecundity of the monster as a symbol leads him to state, the crucial question is not, what does the phantom signify? But, how is the very space constituted where entities like the phantom can emerge? The monster phantom, in other words, never stands for a simple or unitary prejudice. It always acts as a fantasy screen upon which viewers and readers inscribe and sexualize meaning. Žižek also seems to be very aware of the dangers of what he calls the so-called psychoanalytic interpretation of art, which operates within a kind of spiral of interpretation so that everything means psychoanalysis. Accordingly, rather than explain the mother's voice in Psycho as the maternal superego, he suggests, turning it around, to explain the very logic of the maternal superego by means of this vocal strain. But Žižek does not always sustain his challenge to the hegemonic structure of psychoanalysis. Indeed, he often stays firmly within the interpretive confines of the psychoanalytic model and merely uses cultural texts and examples of psychoanalytic functions, particularly Lacanian functions. Within this model, the Phantom of the Opera, for example, is a fetish. It literally stands in for various kinds of antagonisms, class-based, racial, economic, national, etc. But the fetish remains always a sexual mechanism, and this is where Žižek's analysis is doomed to reproduce the process which it attempts to explain. The fetish is a sexualized object that stands in for and indeed covers up other kinds of antagonism. Žižek gives, as an example of the fetishistic role of the phantom, the Jew of anti-Semitic discourse. While this book will also make concrete connections between anti-Semitism and the Gothic production of monsters, and indeed, between racial and sexual layers of signification, it is crucial to an interpretation of Gothic to understand that the Jew, phantom, monster is sexualized within fictional narratives, and this includes pseudoscientific and social scientific narratives that are usually classified as nonfiction, as a part of the narrative process that transforms class, race, gender threat into sexual threat. Žižek's claim, then, that the Jew is the anal object par excellence, that is to say, the partial object stain that disturbs the harmony of the class relationship, precisely leaves intact the sexualization of Jewishness. His assertion that the phantom of the living dead is the emergence of the anal father or primal father, and the opposite of paternal law reinscribes parental, symbolic or otherwise, relations into a scene that precisely seems to escape the familial. His claim, finally, that vampires do not appear in mirrors because they have read their Lacan and know, therefore, that they materialize object A which, by definition, cannot be mirrored, begs to be read as a parody of what it invokes, but instead actually continues to posit subjects that simply do not exist independent of their production in Lacanian psychoanalysis. The vampire of the 19th century narrative has most certainly not read his/her Lacan, avant la lettre, and does not know that he/she cannot be mirrored. This vampire crawls face down along the wall dividing self from other, class from race from gender, and drains metaphoricity from one place only to infuse it in another. While Žižek claims often in his work to be using psychoanalysis, and specifically Lacan, to explain popular culture paradigms, too often he merely uses popular culture to explain Lacan. And, of course, This particular relationship between host and parasite is the only one that psychoanalytic discourse can endorse. Zizek warns, the analysis that focuses on the ideological meaning of monsters overlooks the fact that, before signifying something, before serving as a vessel of meaning, monsters embody enjoyment qua the limit of interpretation, that is to say, non-meaning as such. The idea that a realm of non-meaning exists prior to interpretation is only possible in a structural universe in which form and content can easily be separated. Gothic literature in particular is a rhetorical form which resists the disintegration of form and content. Monstrosity always unites monstrous form with monstrous meaning. In Skin Shows, I will be situating Gothic as a site or topos in 19th century fiction, 1800s, and contemporary horror film. In its typical form, the Gothic topos is the monstrous body a la Frankenstein, Dracula, Dorian Gray, Jekyll Hyde. In its generic form, Gothic is the disruption of realism and of all generic purity. It is the hideous eruption of the monstrous in the heart of domestic England, but it is also the narrative that calls genre itself into question. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I think functions as an allegory of Gothic production, contains a domestic tableau of family life, the de Lacys, right in the heart of the narrative. This structure inverts and threatens to maintain a reversal whereby, rather than the Gothic residing in the dark corners of realism, the realistic is buried alive in the gloomy recesses of Gothic. It may well be that the novel is always Gothic. Gothic Gnomes. In her 1832 introduction to Frankenstein, Shelley writes, I bid my hideous progeny go forth and prosper. Shelley's hideous progeny was not merely her novel, but the 19th century 1800s Gothic novel itself. The Gothic, of course, did indeed prosper and thrive through the century. It grew in popularity until, by the turn of the century, its readership was massive enough that a writer could actually make a living from the sale of his Gothic works. In 1891, for example, Robert Louis Stevenson loosed his shilling shocker, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, upon the reading public, hoping for commercial returns. Stevenson described his novella as a Gothic gnome and worried that he had produced a gross distortion of literature. Such an anxiety marked Gothic itself as a monstrous form in relation to its popularity and its improper subject matter. The appellation Gothic gnome labeled the genre as a mutation or hybrid form of true art and genteel literature. But monsters do indeed sell books, and books sell monsters, and the very popularity of the Gothic suggests that readers and writers collaborate in the production of the features of monstrosity. Gothic novels, in fact, thematize the monstrous aspects of both production and consumption. Frankenstein is, after all, an allegory about a production that refuses to submit to its author, and Dracula is a novel about an arch-consumer, the vampire, who feeds upon middle-class women and then turns them into vampires by forcing them to feed upon him. The Gothic, in fact, like the vampire itself, creates a public who consumes monstrosity, who revels in it, and who then surveys its individual members for signs of deviance or monstrosity, excess or violence. Anxiety about the effects of consuming popular literature revealed itself in England in the 1890s in the form of essays and books which denounced certain works as degenerate, a label defined by Max Nordau's book Degeneration. Although Gothic fiction obviously fell into this category, the censors missed the mark in denouncing such works. Rather than condoning the perversity they recorded, Gothic authors, in fact, seemed quite scrupulous about taking a moral stand against the unnatural acts that produce monstrosity. Long sentimental sermons on truth and purity punctuate many a gruesome tale and leave few doubts as to its morality by the narrative's end. Bram Stoker, for example, sermonizes both in his novels and in an essay printed in the journal The 19th Century called The Censorship of Fiction. In this essay, Stoker calls for stricter surveillance of popular fiction and drama. Stoker thinks censorship would combat human weakness on two levels, namely, the weakness of the great mass of people who form audiences, and of those who are content to do base things in the way of catering for these base appetites. Obviously, Stoker did not expect his own writing to be received as a work that catered to base appetites because, presumably, it used perverse sexuality to identify what or who threatened the dominant class. Similarly, Oscar Wilde was shocked by the critics who called the picture of Dorian Gray poisonous and heavy with mephitic odors of moral and spiritual putrefaction. Wilde's novel, after all, tells the story of a young man seduced by a poisonous book and punished soundly for his corruptions. Wilde defends his work by saying, "It was necessary, sir, for the dramatic development of the story, to surround Dorian Gray with an atmosphere of moral corruption." He continues, "Each man sees his own sin in Dorian Gray." Producing and consuming monsters and monstrous fictions, we might say, adds up to what Eve Sedgwick has called, in her study of Gothic conventions, an aesthetic of pleasurable fear. The Gothic, in other words, inspires fear and desire at the same time, fear of and desire for the other, fear of and desire for the possibly latent perversity lurking within the reader herself. But fear and desire within the same body produce a disciplinary effect. In other words, a Victorian public could consume Gothic novels in vast quantities without regarding such a material as debased, because Gothic gave readers the thrill of reading about so-called perverse activities, while identifying aberrant sexuality as a condition of otherness and as an essential trait of foreign bodies. The monster, of course, marks the distance between the perverse and the supposedly disciplined sexuality of a reader. Also, the signifiers of normal sexuality maintain a kind of hegemonic power by remaining invisible. So, the aesthetic of pleasurable fear that Sedgwick refers to makes pleasure possible only by fixing horror elsewhere, in an obviously and literally foreign body, and by then articulating the need to expel the foreign body. Thus, both Dracula and Hyde are characters with markedly foreign physiognomies. They are dark and venal, foreign in both aspect and behavior. Dracula, for example, is described by Harker as an angular figure with a strong face notable for peculiarly arched nostrils, a lofty domed forehead, bushy hair and eyebrows, sharp white teeth, and ears pointed at the tops. Hyde is described as small and deformed, pale and dwarfish, troglodytic. By making monstrosity so obviously a physical condition and by linking it to sexual corruption, such fictions bind foreign aspects to perverse activities. The most telling example I can find of a monstrous foreigner in Gothic is Bram Stoker's Count Dracula, who obviously comes to England from a distant elsewhere in search of English blood. Critics have discussed at length the perverse and dangerous sexuality exhibited by the vampire, but, with a few exceptions, criticism has not connected Dracula's sexual attacks with the threat of the foreign. Dracula, I argue in my 4th chapter, condenses the xenophobia of Gothic fiction into a very specific horror. The vampire embodies and exhibits all the stereotyping of 19th century, 1800s, anti-Semitism. The anatomy of the vampire, for example, compares remarkably to anti-Semitic studies of Jewish physiognomy, particular nose, pointed ears, sharp teeth, claw-like hands, and furthermore, in Stoker's novel, Blood and Money, central facets in anti-Semitism mark the corruption of the vampire. The vampire merges Jewishness and monstrosity and represents this hybrid monster as a threat to Englishness and English womanhood in particular. In The Jew, then, Gothic fiction finds a monster versatile enough to represent fears about race, nation, and sexuality, a monster who combines in one body fears of the foreign and the perverse. Perversion and parasitism. Within 19th century, 1800s anti-Semitism, the Jew was marked as a threat to capital, to masculinity, and to nationhood. Jews in England at the turn of the century were the objects of an internal colonization. While the black African became the threatening other abroad, it was closer to home that people focused their real fears about the collapse of nation through a desire for racial homogeneity. Jews were referred to as degenerate, the bearers of syphilis, hysterical, neurotic, as bloodsuckers, and, on a more practical level, Jews were viewed as middlemen in business. Not all Gothic novels are as explicit as Dracula about their identification of monster and Jew. In some works we can read a more generalized code of fear which links horror to the Oriental, and in others we must interpret a bodily semiotic that marks monsters as symbols of a diseased culture. But to understand better how the history of the Gothic novel charts the entanglement of race, nation, and sexuality in productions of otherness, we might consider the Gothic monster as the antithesis of Englishness. Benedict Anderson has written about the cultural roots of the nation in terms of imagined communities, which are conceived in language, not in blood. By linking the development of a print industry, particularly the popularization of novels and newspapers, to the spread of nationalism, Anderson pays close attention to the ways in which a shared conception of what constitutes nationness is written and read across certain communities. If the nation, therefore, is a textual production which creates national community in terms of an inside and an outside, and then makes those categories indispensable, Gothic becomes one place to look for a fiction of the foreign, a narrative of who and what is not English and not native. The racism that becomes a mark of 19th century Gothic, 1800s, arises out of the attempt within horror fiction to give form to what terrifies the national community. Gothic monsters are defined both as other than the imagined community and as the being that cannot be imagined as community. Racism and anti-Semitism, Anderson writes, manifest themselves not across national boundaries, but within them. In other words, they justify not so much foreign wars as domestic oppression and domination. The racism and anti-Semitism that I have identified as a hallmark of 19th century 1800s Gothic literature certainly direct themselves towards a domestic rather than a foreign scene. Gothic in the 1890s, as represented by the works of Robert Louis Stevenson, Bram Stoker, and Oscar Wilde, takes place in the back streets of London, in laboratories and asylums, in old abandoned houses and decaying city streets, in hospitals and bedrooms, in homes and gardens. The monster, such a narrative suggests, will find you in the intimacy of your own home. Indeed, it will make your home its home, or you its home, and alter forever the comfort of domestic privacy. The monster peeps through the window, enters through the back door, and sits beside you in the parlor. The monster is always invited in, but never asked to stay. The racism that seems to adhere to the 19th century 1800s Gothic monster, then, may be drawn from imperialistic or colonialist fantasies of other lands and people, but it concentrates its imaginative force upon the other peoples in our lands, the monsters at home. The figure of the parasite becomes paramount within Gothic precisely because it is an internal, not an external danger that Gothic identifies and attempts to dispel. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt has argued convincingly that the modern category of anti-Semitism emerges from both 19th century 1800s attempts to make race the key to history, and the particular history of the Jews as a people without a government, without a country, and without a language. As such, the Jew, with regards to nation and, for our purposes, to English nationality, might be said to represent the not English, the not middle class, the parasitical tribe that drains but never restores or produces. Arendt shows how the decline of the aristocracy and of nationalism by the mid-19th century, 1800s, made people seek new ground for both commonality and superiority. She writes, "For if race doctrines finally served more sinister and immediately political purposes, it is still true that much of their plausibility and persuasiveness lay in the fact that they helped anybody feel himself an aristocrat who had been selected by birth on the strength of racial qualification." Arendt's point is of central importance to an understanding of the history of Gothic. We might note in passing that, from the late 18th century 1700s to the 19th century 1800s, the terrain of Gothic horror shifted from the fear of corrupted aristocracy or clergy, represented by the haunted castle or abbey, to the fear embodied by monstrous bodies. Reading Gothic with 19th century 1800s ideologies of race suggests why this shift occurs. If then, with the rise of bourgeois culture, aristocratic heritage became less and less of an index of essential national identity, the construction of national unity increasingly depended upon the category of race and class. Therefore, the blood of nobility now became the blood of the native, and both were identified in contradistinction to so-called impure races, such as Jews and Gypsies. The nobility, furthermore, gave way to a middle class identified by both their relation to capital as producers and consumers, and a normal sexuality that leads to reproduction. The Gothic novel, I have been arguing, establishes the terms of monstrosity that were to be, and indeed were in the process of being, projected onto all who threatened the interests of a dwindling English nationalism. As the English Empire stretched over oceans and continents, the need to define an essential English character became more and more pressing. Non-nationals like Jews, for example, but also like the Irish or Gypsies, came to be increasingly identified by their alien natures, and the concept of foreign became ever more closely associated with a kind of parasitical monstrosity, a non-reproductive sexuality, and an anti-English character. Gothic monsters in the 1880s and 1890s made parasitism, vampirism, the defining characteristic of horror. The parasitical nature of the beast might be quite literal, as in Stoker's vampire, or it might be a more indirect trait, as suggested by the creeping and homeless Hyde. It might be defined by a homoerotic influence, as exerted by Dorian Gray. Parasitism, especially with regards to the vampire, represents a bad or pathological sexuality, non-reproductive sexuality, a sexuality that exhausts and wastes and exists prior to and outside of the marriage contract. The ability of race ideology and sexology to create a new elite to replace the aristocracy also allows for the staging of historical battles within the body. This suggests how Gothic monstrosity may intersect with, participate in, and resist the production of a theory of racial superiority. The Gothic monster, Frankenstein's creature, Hyde, Dorian Gray, and Dracula, represents the dramatization of the race question and of sexology in their many different incarnations. If Frankenstein's monster articulates the injustice of demonizing one's own productions, Hyde suggests that the most respectable bodies may be contaminated by bad blood, and if Dorian Gray's portrait makes an essential connection between the homosexual and the uncanny, Dracula embodies once and for all the danger of the hybrid race and the perverse sexuality within the form of the vampire.